The whole world adored Dorothy's innocence, but behind those legendary red shoes lay a living hell. MGM didn't treat Judy Garland as a human being, but as a money-making machine. To exploit her labor, they forced the 16-year-old to swallow stimulants, to work frantically for 72 hours without sleep, then administered high doses of tranquilizers to incapacitate her. They didn't create a legend in the conventional way. They ruthlessly turned a child into an addict for box office revenue. The glory of The Wizard of Oz was actually fueled by Judy's own agonizing suffering. However, this nightmare did not begin on the yellow brick road. It started 4 years earlier, when her only line of defense suddenly collapsed. With the death of her father in 1935, the 13-year-old was left defenseless against her ambitious mother, who delivered her straight to Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. But studio boss Louis B. Mayer didn't see a star. He saw a fat little hunchback. To him, she was too short and too plain, a physical problem that the studio would resort to drastic measures to fix. Mayer renamed her Judy Garland, but privately he stripped her of her dignity. He called her my little hunchback. He referred to her as a fat little pig in front of cast and crew. These were not casual insults. They were psychological weapons designed to break her will. By convincing Judy that she was physically repulsive, Mayer ensured that she would be grateful for any scrap of attention the studio gave her. He made her believe that her talent was a fluke, and her appearance was a liability that only MGM could fix. The studio took total control of her biology. They declared war on her weight. The diet imposed on Judy Garland was a form of torture. At 14, 15, 16 years old, ages where the human body requires massive amounts of energy for development, she was starved. Her daily intake was restricted to chicken broth, black coffee, and cottage cheese. Solid food was contraband. Studio spies, often led by her own mother, watched her every move. If she reached for a roll at the commissary, a hand would slap it away. If she was caught smuggling a candy bar, she was berated and shamed. To combat the gnawing, constant pain of hunger, the studio ordered her to smoke. Cigarettes were an appetite suppressant. She smoked up to 80 a day, her lungs filling with smoke while her stomach screamed for food. But starvation makes a person lethargic, and MGM needed energy. They needed the girl to dance for hours, to sing with power, to be the bubbling fountain of youth the scripts demanded. The solution was to industrialize the drug regimen her mother had started. The studio doctors were not healers. They were mechanics paid to keep the machinery running. They prescribed benzedrine in massive doses. The pep pills were distributed on set by assistants, handed out like mints. When Judy's energy flagged during an 18-hour shoot, she was given a pill. When her eyes drooped under the hot lights, she was given a pill. The prescribed stimulants hit her empty stomach and rocketed through her system. It killed the hunger. It banished the fatigue. She could work for hours on end, fueled by little more than broth and medication, but the crash was inevitable. At the end of these marathons, she would be a vibrating wire of tension. The studio doctors would then administer heavy sedatives. They didn't offer restful sleep. They induced an artificial slumber. 4 hours later, they would drag her out of bed, still groggy, and start the cycle again. This constant pharmacological seesaw severely damaged her nervous system. She was stripped of the ability to regulate her own exhaustion. The Judy Garland the world fell in love with was in many ways an illusion sustained by the studio's doctors. Her bright eyes were often dilated from medication. Her slender frame was the result of enforced malnutrition. The control extended beyond the medical. When she was cast in The Wizard of Oz, she was 16, a developing young woman. Yet, MGM demanded a 12-year-old child. Costumers strapped her into a rigid device to flatten her chest. They used tight binding to hide her curves, winding it so tight she struggled to breathe. She was a maturing young woman trapped in a child's costume, surrounded by powerful studio executives who viewed her as their property. Furthermore, multiple biographers note that Louis B. Mayer's so-called fatherly affection frequently crossed the line into deeply inappropriate and controlling behavior. He would place his hand on her left breast, squeezing it under the guise of feeling her heartbeat to see if she was singing with emotion. Judy, conditioned to view obedience as survival, stood frozen and took it. She knew that this man held the keys to the medicine cabinet. He controlled the pills that allowed her to function. To reject him was to risk withdrawal, starvation, and exile. The set of Oz itself was a nightmare landscape. Judy later alleged that the actors playing the Munchkins, adult men with dwarfism, were aggressive and sexually predatory. She recounted harrowing stories of how they would reach under her dress, pinching and grabbing her legs during the crowd scenes. She was surrounded by leering men, high on speed, starving and strapped into a painful corset, yet she had to skip down the road and look enchanted. The dissociation required to survive this was immense. She learned to separate her mind from her body. Her body belonged to MGM. Her mind retreated into the fog of the drugs. The golden age machinery did not just use Judy, it consumed her. By the time she was 20, she was an addict with the liver of an alcoholic and the emotional stability of a shattered pane of glass. She had been taught that her natural self was worthless and that her artificial self, the high, thin, energetic star, was the only version of her that deserved to exist. This was not a lifestyle choice. It was a survival strategy engineered by a corporation that prioritized box office receipts over the life of a child. She was a canary in a coal mine, singing her heart out while the gas filled the room, and the executives watched from behind the glass, counting the money and refilling the prescription. But a machine run at maximum capacity without maintenance eventually seizes. The success of The Wizard of Oz validated the method of abuse, ensuring it would continue until the gears finally stripped. For 15 years, MGM rode the momentum of her addiction, ignoring the warning signs of her physical collapse. However, when the biological cost of the drugs finally outweighed the box office receipts, the studio did not offer repair. They initiated disposal. The severance of the relationship between the creator and the creation would prove to be as violent as the manufacturing process itself. The violence on set was not just sexual, it was physical and disciplinary. The director, Victor Fleming, was a bully who used intimidation as a tool. When Judy, exhausted and high on speed, couldn't stop giggling during a take with the Cowardly Lion, Fleming didn't call for a break. He dragged her off the set, slapped her across the face, and ordered her back to work. Judy did not storm off. Conditioned to believe her emotions were inconveniences, she swallowed the humiliation, dried her tears, and went back to the mark. By the time The Wizard of Oz wrapped, Judy Garland was chemically dependent. She could not sleep without a barbiturate. She could not wake without an amphetamine. Her metabolism was wrecked. Her self-image was shattered. She was a hollowed-out vessel filled with chemicals, held together by a corset and the fear of failure. The premiere of the film in 1939 was the final lock clicking into place. The movie was a sensation. Judy Garland was hailed as the greatest child star in the world. She was given a special Academy Award. The applause was deafening. But the success was a trap. If the studio had failed, perhaps she would have been released. Perhaps she would have faded into obscurity and regained her health. But she succeeded. The method, the starvation, the drugs, the abuse had worked. It had produced a masterpiece. Therefore, in the eyes of MGM, the method was validated. They had the formula for a star, and they had no intention of changing it. The success of Oz condemned her to a lifetime of the same treatment. The studio immediately threw her into a series of Let's Put on a Show musicals with Mickey Rooney. The pace accelerated. The Babes in Arms era was a blur of frantic activity. MGM paired Judy and Mickey, two teenagers fueled by speed, and worked them until they dropped. Mickey Rooney later described the regimen. They took us to the studio hospital and knocked us cold with sleeping pills. Then after 4 hours, they'd wake us up and give us the pep pills again so we could work another 72 hours. This was not an artistic collaboration. It was a forced labor camp. The studio extracted every ounce of energy from their bodies. When Judy's weight fluctuated, a normal occurrence for a teenager, Mayer would scream at her. He would shame her in front of the crew. The diet police would return. The cycle of starvation and binging began, a precursor to the eating disorder that would plague her for the rest of her life. The drugs began to change her personality. The sweet, compliant girl began to exhibit signs of paranoia and aggression. These were classic symptoms of amphetamine abuse, but the studio interpreted them as temperament. They labeled her difficult. They created a narrative that Judy Garland was an unruly diva, shifting the blame from the poison they were feeding her to the victim who was reacting to it. By 1943, at the age of 21, Judy was a veteran of the industry and a hardened addict. Her marriage to David Rose was crumbling, undermined by the studio's interference and her own instability. She was pregnant. A child offered a way out. A baby meant a pause. It meant a reason to stop the drugs, to eat, to rest. It was a lifeline to normalcy. MGM saw it as a disaster. A pregnant Judy Garland could not play the eternal teenager. A mother could not be Dorothy. The girl next door could not have a baby. Mayer and the studio executives pressured her. They enlisted her mother, Ethel, to join the chorus. They told her that having a baby would destroy her career. They told her the public would abandon her. They told her she was too unstable to be a mother. Under intense coercion, Judy Garland had an abortion. This was the psychic break. The studio had taken her childhood, her health, her autonomy, and now they had taken her child. The abortion was not a choice. It was a sacrifice on the altar of MGM. The resentment began to boil. The compliance that had defined her early years began to fracture. She started to miss call times. She started to lock herself in her dressing room. She was too high to work or too sedated to stand. The studio's response was not to send her to rehab. Rehab didn't exist for assets, but to suspend her. They cut her pay. They sued her. They pushed the animal into the corner and punished it for biting. The 1940s became a slow-motion car crash. Judy's talent matured into a terrifying raw power. Her voice deepened, gaining a vibrato that sounded like a sob. Her performances in films like Meet Me in St. Louis and The Harvey Girls were brilliant, but they were the performances of a woman on the edge. The camera captured the frantic gleam in her eyes, the slight tremor in her hands. The audience thought it was passion. It was withdrawal. Her personal life descended into chaos. She married Vincente Minnelli, a director who valued the aesthetic over the human. They had a daughter, Liza, but Judy was ill-equipped for motherhood. How could she nurture a child when she couldn't nurture herself? She loved Liza fiercely, but love could not neutralize the seconal in her blood. The studio system began to view her as a liability. The little hunchback was now a troubled woman. They began to cast her in fewer roles. They loaned her out. They treated her like a broken appliance that was too expensive to fix, but too valuable to throw away. Then came the final humiliation at MGM. In 1950, during the production of Summer Stock, Judy was struggling. The years of abuse had caught up with her. She was bloated from the medication, then gaunt from the crash diets. She was hallucinating. She was missing days. MGM, the entity that had created her addiction, fired her. They released a statement citing her unreliability. They washed their hands of the monster they had built. After 15 years of extracting her blood, sweat, and sanity, they cut her loose without a severance, without medical support, and without a future. But the addiction did not sign a release form. The Benzedrine did not care about the contract. Judy was now alone in the world, a woman who had never written a check, never cooked a meal, never lived a day without a handler, and who required a lethal cocktail of drugs just to get out of bed. She entered the 1950s not as a star, but as a survivor of a wreck, walking away from the crash site with internal bleeding that no one could see. The studio gate closed behind her, but the prison bars were now inside her veins. This severance was effectively an amputation. For 15 years, the studio had functioned as her parent, her doctor, her bank, and her dealer. They had dictated when she woke, what she ate, and when she slept. So when the gates of the Culver City lot finally closed behind her, she was left with the survival capacity of an infant. She had no concept of money. She had no understanding of how to book a doctor's appointment or negotiate a contract. She was a creature of the sound stage, an organism that had evolved to thrive only under the artificial sun of the arc lights. The silence that followed was deafening. Without the frantic schedule of the studio, the chemical regimen that had sustained her became a weapon turned inward. The Benzedrine, no longer burning off through 18 hours of dancing, simply vibrated in her nerves. The Seconal, no longer a necessary tool for a 4-hour nap, became an escape hatch from the terrifying reality of her obsolescence. The immediate aftermath was a spiral into self-destruction. In June 1950, shortly after her suspension from the film Royal Wedding, Judy retreated to the bathroom of her rented home. She broke a glass and slashed her throat. The media reported it as a dramatic gesture, a cry for help from a spoiled star. The studio executives rolled their eyes, viewing it as yet another example of her temperament. But this was not theater. It was the logical conclusion of the programming MGM had installed. They had taught her that her value lay entirely in her ability to perform. If she could not perform, she did not exist. The attempt was a physical manifestation of the psychological annihilation she felt. She survived, but the scar on her neck became a permanent reminder of the moment the industry decided she was disposable. But the machinery of Hollywood is efficient at recycling. If Judy Garland could no longer be a film star, if she was too unreliable, too bloated, too visibly damaged for the close-up, she could still be sold. Enter Sid Luft. Luft was a promoter, a man who saw in the wreckage of Judy Garland not a tragedy, but an opportunity. He became her manager and eventually her third husband. Luft recognized that while the film industry had rejected her, the public had not. The Dorothy myth was still potent. The voice, though ravaged by smoke and alcohol, had acquired a new, terrifying texture. It was no longer the innocent trill of a girl. It was the raw, open wound of a woman who had seen hell. Luft pivoted her away from the cameras and toward the stage. He booked her at the London Palladium, in 1951. This transition marked the beginning of the concert years, a period often romanticized as a triumph of the human spirit. In reality, it was a shift in the method of extraction. MGM had extracted her labor in a closed environment. The concert circuit extracted her soul in public. The Palladium shows were a sensation. The British audience, battered by the aftermath of the war, connected with Judy's vulnerability. When she walked onto the stage, trembling, clutching the microphone like a lifeline, they didn't see a failure. They saw a survivor. They roared their approval. For Judy, this applause was a new drug, more potent than the Benzedrine. It was the validation she had been starved of since childhood. But the cost of accessing it was high. To face the terrifying void of a live audience, to overcome the crippling stage fright that made her vomit in the wings, she needed the chemistry. The cycle mutated. Before, the drugs were used to keep her working for the camera. Now, they were used to manage the terror of the stage. She took pills to calm the shaking hands. She took pills to kill the nausea. She took pills to summon the energy to belt out, "Get happy." The comeback was fueled by the same poison that caused the crash. In 1954, Hollywood beckoned again. Warner Brothers, seeing the money she was generating on stage, decided to take a gamble. They cast her in A Star is Born. The production of this film mirrors the tragedy of her life with eerie precision. Judy played Esther Blodgett, a rising star, opposite James Mason's Norman Maine, a fading alcoholic actor. The lines between fiction and reality blurred. Judy poured her own trauma into the role. The scene where she sings "The Man That Got Away" is not acting. It is a documentary of her internal state. The desperation in her eyes is real, but the set was a nightmare. The old habits returned. The pressure to carry a multi-million-dollar production triggered the old anxieties. She missed days. She fluctuated in weight. The studio panicked. They labeled her difficult again. They cut the film's runtime, butchering her performance to fit more screenings per day. Despite the sabotage, her performance was undeniable. It was raw, visceral, and brilliant. She was nominated for the Academy Award for Best Actress. The night of the Oscars, Judy was in the hospital, having just given birth to her son Joey. Cameras were set up in her room, ready to broadcast her victory speech. She was the favorite. The narrative was perfect. The fallen star redeemed, the mother holding her newborn, clutching the golden statue. Grace Kelly won for the country girl. The cameras in Judy's room were dismantled before the applause for Kelly had even died down. The technicians packed up the cables and lights without a word. The silence returned. The loss devastated her. It confirmed her deepest fear. She was not good enough. After 1954, the decline accelerated. The pep pills were no longer just for work. They were for existence. Her metabolism, wrecked by years of starvation diets, began to fail. Her liver, assaulted by years of alcohol and prescription drugs, began to swell. By the late 1950s, her body was in revolt. She was diagnosed with acute hepatitis. The doctors at the hospital told her the news with grim finality. She would never work again. They said she might not even walk again. Her body was filled with fluid. She was bloated, unrecognizable. The little hunchback narrative seemed to have won. But Judy Garland was a creature of defiance. She was also a creature of necessity. She had no savings. The money she earned, millions of dollars over 2 decades, had evaporated. It went to agents, to managers, to husbands, to the IRS. She was broke. She couldn't afford to die. She couldn't afford to be an invalid. She checked herself out of the hospital. She went back to the only thing she knew. She went back to the pills. She returned to the road. The late 50s and early 60s became a blur of one-night stands, concert halls, and hotel rooms. The touring was relentless because the debt was bottomless. She was singing for her supper quite literally. The Pavlovian dog response was now fully entrenched. The sound of an orchestra tuning up triggered a chemical release in her brain. She could be comatose in her dressing room 5 minutes before curtain, unable to stand, slurring her words. Her handlers, Luft, or whoever was managing her at the time, would drag her to the wings. They would push her toward the light. And then the transformation would happen. The music would start. The lights would hit her, and Judy Garland would activate. The adrenaline would override the exhaustion. The voice would tear out of her throat, defying the laws of physiology. This was the mechanism of her life in the wilderness years. She was a battery being drained and recharged, with the intervals between charges getting shorter and shorter. The chemicals were eating the lining of her stomach. Her voice began to crack, losing its upper register, but gaining a tragic pathos that the audience devoured. They didn't come to hear perfect notes anymore. They came to watch the high wire act. They came to see if she would fall. By 1960, the medical consensus on Judy Garland was unanimous. She was a terminal case. The doctors at Doctors Hospital in New York, who had treated her for acute hepatitis, had tapped gallons of fluid from her body. They told her, with the detached certainty of science, that her liver was permanently compromised. They told her that her heart, strained by 40 years of chemical acceleration and deceleration, was fragile. They told her explicitly that she would never perform again. Judy Garland listened to the prognosis, checked herself out of the hospital, and went back to work. The comeback of the early 1960s is often framed as a triumph. In reality, it was a biological impossibility sustained by a new and more aggressive chemical regimen. To shed the water weight from the hepatitis, she consumed diuretics in dangerous quantities. To combat the lethargy of a failing liver, she increased her intake of stimulants. The Benzedrine of her youth had been supplemented or replaced by Ritalin, a drug that provided a sharper, more jagged energy. The transformation was terrifying. In a matter of months, the bloated invalid transformed into a waif. She was skeletal. Her eyes, always large, now dominated her face, staring out with a frantic, vibrating intensity. She looked like a woman who was burning from the inside out. The apex of this desperate resurrection occurred at Carnegie Hall on April 23, 1961. History records it as the greatest night in show business history. The double album recorded that evening won 5 Grammy Awards. But listen to the recording without the nostalgia. Listen to the voice. It is not the pure bell-like instrument of the MGM years. It is a weapon. It is guttural, raw, and trembling, with a chaotic power. When she sings San Francisco, she isn't singing a melody. She is shouting down her own exhaustion. She pushes the tempo, rushing the orchestra, driving the song forward with a manic urgency that suggests she is afraid the energy will cut out before the final note. The dynamic in the room was predatory. Judy fed off the adoration of the crowd, using their applause as a substitute for the serotonin her brain could no longer produce. The crowd fed off her vulnerability. They screamed her name. They rushed the stage. They reached out to touch the hem of her dress. Backstage, the reality was stark. Between sets, handlers were there with water, with towels, and almost certainly with the chemical assistance required to keep a woman with a failing liver standing upright for 2 hours. The success of the concert tour attracted the attention of the television networks. CBS, looking for a flagship variety show, offered Judy a contract. The Judy Garland show premiered in 1963. It was intended to be her stability. A weekly show meant she could stay in Los Angeles. She could be a mother to her 3 children, Liza, Lorna, and Joey. But television is a factory, and Judy Garland had PTSD from factories. The production was a disaster. CBS executives, accustomed to the rigid efficiency of television, did not know how to handle a star who operated on Garland time. Judy, fueled by Ritalin and alcohol, was erratic. She would arrive late. She would lock herself in her dressing room. She would be manic one moment and catatonic the next. The network tried to fix her. They fired showrunners. They changed the format. They tried to make her more mainstream. They smoothed out her hair, put her in stiff gowns, and told her to stop touching the guests. They wanted a wholesome host. They had signed a raw nerve. To get through the rehearsals, the taping, and the publicity, Judy's drug use escalated. The cocktail now included significant amounts of alcohol. Blue Nun wine became a staple. She drank it medicinally to counteract the jitters from the stimulants. The physical toll was visible on screen. In the early episodes, she looks relatively healthy. By the middle of the season, she is gaunt. Her hands shake so badly she has to clasp them together or hold onto the microphone stand for stability. Her speech is sometimes slurred, a distinct mushiness caused by the interaction of sedatives and alcohol. But CBS didn't want the raw emotion. They wanted ratings. The Judy Garland show was programmed against the #1 show in the country. It was a suicide slot. The ratings tanked. The cancellation of the show in 1964 was the second great rejection of her life, echoing the firing from MGM. It broke her financially and spiritually. She had tried to play by the rules. She had tried to do the steady job, and she had failed. While Judy was killing herself on the sound stage of Television City, her finances were being looted. This is a critical component of her destruction. Judy Garland generated millions of dollars, yet she was perpetually broke. Why? The answer lies in the system of agency and management that surrounded her. David Begelman and Freddie Fields, her agents, were embezzling funds on a massive scale. They booked her for concerts, took the fees, and funneled the money into their own accounts, or used it to cover expenses that were largely fictitious. Judy never saw a paycheck. She was given an allowance of cash. She lived in rented houses. She didn't own the masters of her recordings. She didn't own the rights to her image. When the CBS show was canceled, the house of cards collapsed. The IRS came calling for back taxes. The agents claimed they were owed commissions. The hotels demanded payment. Judy Garland, the woman who had filled Carnegie Hall, found herself unable to pay her grocery bill. The collapse of her professional life coincided with the disintegration of her personal life. She divorced Sid Luft in 1965. The custody battle for Lorna and Joey was brutal. Judy loved her children with a fierce, suffocating intensity, but she was incapable of providing stability. She dragged them from hotel to hotel. They slept in dressing rooms. They were exposed to her drug use, her suicide attempts, her manic episodes. Liza Minnelli, her eldest daughter, had effectively become the parent. By the age of 16, Liza was managing her mother's pill intake, checking her pulse and hiding the razors. By 1965, Judy Garland was a nomad. She had no home. She had no contract. She was uninsurable for film work. The major concert venues began to view her as a liability. She began to take smaller gigs. She played nightclubs. She had already faced humiliation in Australia. The tour of Australia in 1964 had been a catastrophe. At a concert in Melbourne, she arrived on stage an hour late, stumbling. The audience, sensing blood, turned on her. They heckled her. They booed. Judy, high and disoriented, tried to fight back. She yelled at the crowd. She tried to sing over them. But the magic was gone. The Pavlovian switch had failed. The chemicals could no longer override the exhaustion. She was booed off the stage. The press had a field day. The tragic end of Judy Garland, the headlines read. They feasted on the carcass of her career. But she kept going. She had to. The IRS was garnishing her wages. Every dollar she earned was seized before she could touch it. She was running on a treadmill that was moving faster than she could run, and the only fuel she had was the pills. She began to drift. She stayed on the couches of friends. She stayed in hotels where the managers looked the other way when the bill wasn't paid. She was a ghost, haunting the edges of the industry that had created her. As the late 1960s approached, the stage was set for the final act. She would go to London. London had always loved her. London had saved her before, at the Palladium. She believed, with the delusional optimism of the addict, that it could save her again. She was wrong. London would not be a sanctuary. It would be a graveyard. By 1968, the woman who had generated millions for Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer was effectively homeless. She carried her life in shopping bags, moving between the guest rooms of shrinking acquaintances and the lobbies of hotels where her credit had not yet been exhausted. The industry that had manufactured her addiction had finally revoked her access to the machinery of fame, leaving her to navigate the wreckage of her biology without a map. She was 46 years old, but her medical profile read like that of a geriatric patient in late-stage decline. Her liver was enlarged, pressing against her ribs. Her kidneys were failing. The peripheral neuropathy in her feet, a result of decades of malnutrition and alcohol abuse, made walking a conscious, painful effort. In this state of vulnerability, she met Mickey Deans. Deans was 12 years younger, a discotheque manager and musician who moved in the nocturnal circles of New York City. He was not a studio mogul or a high-powered agent. He was a hustler. Their meeting in 1966 is often romanticized, but the reality was transactional. Deans delivered a package of stimulants to her hotel room at the St. Regis. He arrived as a delivery system for the chemistry she required to function. He stayed because he saw an opportunity. Deans became the final handler in a long line of men who viewed Judy Garland as a resource to be managed. Under his guidance, the strategy was not preservation, it was extraction. The goal was to squeeze the last drops of revenue from a dying brand. Deans arranged a 5-week residency at the Talk of the Town nightclub in London. It was a desperate gamble. The venue was a cabaret, a dinner club, where the audience ate steak and drank wine while the performer worked. It was a step down from the concert halls, a return to the vaudeville grind of her childhood, but with higher stakes and lower dignity. The engagement at the Talk of the Town in January 1969 stands as the grim nadir of her professional life. Judy was in no condition to perform. The flight to London had exhausted her. The flu ravaged her weakened immune system. She arrived at the club late, night after night. This was not arrogance, it was incapacity. It took hours to medicate her into a state where she could stand. It took hours to paint the mask of Judy Garland over the gray, wasted face of Frances Gumm. The audience did not care about the mechanics of her survival. They had paid for a ticket. They had paid for dinner. They expected the Dorothy of 1939. When they got the dying woman of 1969, they turned feral. On the worst nights, she would stumble onto the stage an hour behind schedule, gripping the microphone stand to keep from falling. Her speech was slurred, the vowels stretching out into incoherent moans. The crowd responded with violence. They didn't just leave, they attacked. They threw dinner rolls, they threw cigarette packs, they threw wadded up napkins. They heckled her, shouting, "Drunk," and "Get off the stage." Judy Garland stood in the spotlight, blinded by the glare, pelted with the debris of their dinner, and tried to smile. The Disney training held firm even as her body collapsed. The show must go on. She tried to joke with the hecklers, her voice trembling, desperate to win back the love that had been her only sustenance since age 2. She was booed off the stage. Amidst this professional slaughter, she married Mickey Deans. The wedding took place on March 15, 1969, at the Chelsea Register office. It was her 5th marriage. It was a bleak, hollow affair that underscored her total isolation. None of her famous friends attended. Her daughter, Liza Minnelli, was absent, reportedly telling her mother, "I can't watch you do this again." The reception was held at a club called Quaglino's. It was sparsely attended. The press photos from that day are harrowing. Judy is wearing a blue dress, a feather hat, and a smile that looks painted on a skull. She weighs less than 90 pounds. Her arms are stick-thin. She clings to Deans, not with the joy of a bride, but with the desperation of a drowning swimmer clutching a piece of driftwood. The marriage did not bring stability. It brought a final acceleration of the decline. Deans was trying to secure a deal for a chain of Judy Garland movie theaters, a frantic attempt to monetize her name since her voice was failing. Judy was just trying to survive the day. The weeks following the Talk of the Town disaster were a blur of illness and erratic behavior. The couple moved into a small rented Muse house in Belgravia. It was a modest, cramped space. The walls were thin. The stairs were steep. It was a house for a young couple starting out, not a sanctuary for a legend ending her life. On the morning of June 22nd, 1969, the final act played out in silence. In the quiet of the rented Chelsea Muse, Judy retreated to the bathroom, her lifelong sanctuary from the noise. She took her usual dose of Seconal. We will never know if it was a miscalculation of tolerance or a moment of surrendered exhaustion. When Mickey Deans found the door locked hours later, the silence was heavy. Climbing through the bathroom window from the porch roof, he found the legend slumped forward on the toilet, her hands resting loosely in her lap. Rigor mortis had begun to set in. The warmth of life had evaporated hours ago. The frantic heart that Louis B. Mayer had wound up like a toy in 1935 had finally utterly stopped beating. The immediate aftermath of the discovery was a chaotic collision of the mundane and the macabre. Deans called his doctor, then he called the police. The machinery of the state began to process the body of Frances Gumm, just as the machinery of the studio had processed her life. Scotland Yard arrived. They did not see a star. They saw a middle-aged woman in a state of severe physical neglect. The bathroom was cluttered. The medicine cabinet was a pharmacy of sedatives and stimulants. The autopsy, conducted by Coroner Gavin Thurston at the Westminster Mortuary, was a forensic indictment of the Hollywood studio system. It was not merely a determination of the cause of death. It was an inventory of destruction. The official cause of death was listed as incidental barbiturate poisoning. It was an overdose of Seconal. But the coroner was careful to note that this was not a suicide. There was no massive concentration of residue in her stomach, suggesting she had swallowed a handful of pills in a final act of despair. Instead, the levels in her blood suggested a gradual accumulation. She had taken a dose to sleep. It hadn't worked. She had taken another and another. Her tolerance was so high that the threshold between sleep and death had become a razor-thin line. In her exhaustion, she had simply stepped over it. The most damning finding, however, was the condition of her internal organs. Thurston noted that while Judy Garland was 47 years old, her body presented the physiological deterioration of a woman in her 80s. Her liver was in the advanced stages of cirrhosis, scarred and enlarged from decades of alcohol and drug processing. Her kidneys were failing. Her stomach lining was eroded. Her blood vessels were brittle. The report described a body that had been used up. It was a biological engine that had been run at maximum RPM without oil or maintenance for 30 years. The coroner's inquest was a brief, sterile affair. It ruled out foul play. It ruled out suicide. It concluded that Judy Garland had died of self-neglect. While self-neglect implies a personal choice, the evidence suggests she was systematically neglected by the very industry that owned her. The coroner's term masked the reality. She had been conditioned to view her own health as secondary to the studio's schedule. She was neglected by the doctors who prescribed the Seconal. She was neglected by the agents who stole her money. She was neglected by a culture that demanded her soul and offered her nothing but applause in return. Her body was flown back to New York City. The flight was a final grim tour. She traveled in a cargo hold, listed as freight. The woman who had filled Carnegie Hall was now a box on a manifest. The funeral was held at the Frank E. Campbell Funeral Chapel on Madison Avenue. It became a spectacle that rivaled her concerts in intensity and hysteria. New York City in June 1969 was a powder keg. The heat was oppressive. The social fabric of the country was tearing apart over Vietnam and civil rights. Into this atmosphere came the corpse of the woman who symbolized the lost innocence of America. The public reaction was visceral. 20,000 people lined the streets of Manhattan. They stood in the sweltering heat for hours, waiting for a glimpse of the coffin. The crowd was a cross-section of the marginalized. There were housewives who had grown up with Dorothy. There were outcasts, and significantly, there were thousands of gay men. Judy Garland's connection to the gay community was profound and tragic. She was the ultimate icon of suffering and resilience. It is a poignant coincidence that the Stonewall riots, the spark of the modern LGBTQ+ rights movement, erupted in Greenwich Village in the early hours following her funeral on June 27, 1969. The grief over her death mingled with the rage against police brutality. Inside the chapel, the scene was one of Hollywood hypocrisy. James Mason, her co-star from A Star is Born, delivered the eulogy. He spoke with genuine sorrow, but the pews were filled with people who had watched her drown. Studio executives who had blacklisted her were there. Producers who had refused to hire her were there. They wore black. They wiped away tears. They participated in the ritual of mourning the asset they had depleted. Mickey Deans, the widower of 3 months, stood by the coffin. He had already begun the process of selling the rights to his story. He was arranging book deals before the body was in the ground. The extraction continued even after death. Liza Minnelli, barely 23, paid for the funeral. She had to. Her mother had died penniless. The estate of Judy Garland, which should have been worth millions, was millions in debt. There was no inheritance for the children, only a legacy of trauma and a catalog of songs that made other people rich. The burial took place at Ferncliff Cemetery in Hartsdale, New York. For decades, she would lie there, in a crypt that was essentially a storage locker for the famous. It wasn't until 2017 that her children moved her remains to the Hollywood Forever Cemetery in Los Angeles. bringing her back to the city that made her and broke her. But the burial did not bury the story. In the days and weeks following her death, the media narrative began to shift. The initial shock gave way to a forensic examination of her life. The pills, the alcohol, the erratic behavior, the press, which had mocked her as a train wreck in her final years, now framed her as a tragic figure. They missed the point. Tragedy implies a flaw in the character, a hubris that leads to a fall. Judy Garland had no hubris. She had compliance. Her flaw was that she did exactly what she was told. She took the pills she was given. She worked the hours she was assigned. She starved when she was told to starve. Her death was not a tragedy of character. It was a failure of protection. It was a failure of the labor laws that allowed a child to work 18 hours a day. It was a failure of the medical establishment that prescribed addictive narcotics to a teenager. It was a failure of the legal system that allowed agents to embezzle their clients' earnings with impunity. As the 1970s dawned, Judy Garland became a ghost that haunted Hollywood. She became a warning label. Don't end up like Judy, mothers would tell their daughters who wanted to be stars. But the industry didn't change. It just became more sophisticated. The pills changed names from Benzedrine to cocaine, from Seconal to Xanax, but the mechanism remained. The child star was still a raw material. The true horror of Judy Garland's death is found in the absolute solitude of that bathroom in Chelsea. In those final moments, she was not Dorothy. She was not a legend. She was a middle-aged woman in pain, desperate for sleep, reaching for the only tool she had ever been given to manage her existence. She died waiting for the medicine to work. She died waiting for the noise to stop. The world kept spinning. The studio kept making movies. The Wizard of Oz continued to air every year, generating millions in advertising revenue for the network that had fired her. New generations of children watched the girl in the blue dress and dreamed of flying over the rainbow, unaware that the girl on the screen never made it back to Kansas. She died in the poppy field, put to sleep by the very people who built the Emerald City. The discovery of the body marked the end of her suffering, but it signaled the beginning of a new phase of exploitation. The silence of the bathroom was quickly replaced by the gavel of the auctioneer. The industry that had found no use for the living woman suddenly found immense value in the artifacts of her destruction. Death did not liberate Judy Garland from the marketplace. It simply turned her into a vintage commodity. The auction of the ruby slippers in 1970 stands as the definitive post-mortem insult to the life of Judy Garland. Just 1 year after her body was found in a Chelsea bathroom, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, the studio that had chemically engineered her destruction, decided to liquidate its assets. They cleared out the warehouses, they sold the costumes, they sold the props. Among the items was a pair of size 5B shoes covered in red sequins, worn by a 16-year-old girl in 1939. The shoes sold for $15,000. It was a record-breaking sum at the time. Today, those same shoes are valued at over $3 million. They are insured, protected by climate control, and guarded by security systems. When Judy Garland died, her estate was in debt. She had approximately $4,000 to her name. The shoes she wore to make the studio rich were worth more than the woman who wore them. This economic disparity is the final brutal metric of her life. To MGM, the shoes were a durable asset. Judy Garland was a depreciating one. The shoes could be preserved. The girl had been consumed. This commodification did not end with the auction. It accelerated. In the decades following her death, The industry that killed her continued to profit from her ghost. Biographies were written, miniseries were produced, her unreleased recordings were packaged and sold. The Judy Garland industry became more profitable in her death than it had been in her final years of life. The narrative was sanitized. The abuse was reframed as struggle. The starvation was reframed as discipline. The drug addiction was reframed as demons. This linguistic shift is crucial. By blaming demons, Hollywood absolved itself of the crime. Demons are supernatural. They are personal failings. Amphetamines are industrial. They are a supply chain issue. Judy Garland did not battle demons. She battled a corporate policy that mandated the use of narcotics to maintain production schedules. Her death established a blueprint for the tragic child star that the industry would replicate with terrifying efficiency. Judy was patient zero. She was the prototype. The mechanism of her destruction, isolation, chemical dependency, financial exploitation, and public shaming, became the standard operating procedure for handling young talent. Judy Garland's legacy is often tied to the LGBTQ+ community, and rightly so. She is the patron saint of the marginalized. But the reason for this connection goes deeper than over the rainbow. It is rooted in the shared experience of having one's identity policed by a hostile authority. Judy was told by the studio that her natural body was wrong, that her natural instincts were wrong, that she had to be chemically altered to be acceptable. This resonance of forced performance is what makes her an enduring icon of resilience. She stood in the spotlight, battered and bleeding, and refused to stop singing. But resilience should not be confused with survival. Judy Garland did not survive. She was executed by slow poison. The tragedy extended beyond the studio executives to the audience itself. The relationship between Garland and the public was parasitic. Fans fed on her manic energy until there was nothing left, then complained when the husk was no longer entertaining. Every broadcast of The Wizard of Oz became a complicated ritual, a crime scene disguised as a fairy tale, watched by millions who adored the character but consumed the human. It resembles the footage of a captive forced to perform. The girl on the screen is smiling, but if you look at the dilated pupils, if you listen to the breathless quality of her voice, you are witnessing the evidence of abuse. The golden age of Hollywood was built on the bones of children like Frances Gumm. It was a gold rush that used human beings as canaries in the mines. The studio bosses, Mayer, Warner, Cohn, were not dream makers. They were strip miners. They found a vein of talent in a child, extracted it with violence and chemistry, and left the earth scorched. Judy Garland lies today in the Hollywood Forever Cemetery. She is back in the city that made her, surrounded by the ghosts of the industry that broke her. Her grave is a pilgrimage site. Fans leave flowers. They leave rainbow flags. They leave notes thanking her for the magic. But the autopsy report contained no magic. There is no wizardry in the liver failure of a 47-year-old woman, or in the solitary death inside a locked bathroom while the world waited for one more song. The ruby slippers are behind glass, safe and eternal. The girl is gone. The lesson is clear, though we refuse to learn it. You can have the dream or you can have the human. You cannot have both. The price of the ticket was her life, and we are still paying for it every time we watch her dance down that road, pretending we don't know where it leads.